How does the body use energy? Within all of our bodies, there are countless millions of chemical reactions. Basically, they're happening all at one time and all the time. The combination of all of these reactions is what we call metabolism. We, of course, think metabolism is the speed at which you can digest food, but that is not necessarily the case. Regardless, your body needs energy to get this stuff done, all these reactions. In order to get this energy, we eat. We, of course, know at this point we have three main parts of our diet: carbs, proteins, fats, the macronutrients. Only two of those are really used as fuel, and that's carbs and fats. Proteins are more of a building block. We are made of proteins. They're not just about getting big at the gym. Pinky swear. It's just essentially what's giving our body the structure it needs to live and move. Okay, to recap, carbohydrates and fat are the two main sources that our body uses. Whether we use fat or carbohydrate for fuel in our bodies depends on the hormone insulin. Insulin is a small hormone that flows through our blood. It essentially determines what energy the body is using. How does the food we eat affect insulin? What happens to insulin levels when we eat certain types of food? When someone eats pure carbohydrate, like bread, cereal, or a plain apple even, we have a substantial increase in insulin. So it climbs like 10 times higher than normal. It can stay elevated for up to 4 hours. In contrast, if someone's eating fat in their diet, fat alone, it has a negligible effect on insulin. It remains very steady, keeps moving along. So we have these two sources of fuel, fat and carbohydrates. When insulin is elevated, the body makes the decision. At this point, it shifts and it starts to use the carbohydrates. And that's where the primary source of energy comes from. So we're going to call this sugar burning mode, aka your blood sugar raises. In contrast, if insulin levels are low, the body is able to switch and actually uses fat as fuel. It's essentially shifted its energy source. The body is essentially a hybrid SUV. It has the option. It can use two different types of fuels. So in this case, when insulin is low, it's going to choose fat as its primary source of gasoline. If we're burning more sugar, that means we're burning less fat. If we're not burning fat, then the amount of fat that's stored on our body goes up, because insulin will not let us burn that fat as fuel if insulin is elevated. AKA high insulin means a shift to carbohydrate burning, less fat burning. So if we can lower our insulin levels, then we can start to use fat as fuel for energy. It becomes that primary source. So whatever fat we have stored there, that fat tissue will start to shrink because we're now leveraging that fat as fuel instead of just sugar burning when insulin is high. If insulin is too high for too long, it can actually create something called insulin resistance, which you're probably familiar with. It is a hot topic often associated with diabetes. The reason you might not care about it right now is because you do not know the exact intricate details. Insulin resistance can actually cause almost every chronic disease: migraines, high blood pressure, hypertension, diabetes, infertility even has been proven, cancer, excess body fat, stroke, Alzheimer's, when the brain is not working as well. It could be that the brain and body have become insulin resistant. So here, insulin resistance is either the cause or exacerbating all of these types of disorders. So if you do fear any of those that I may have listed, you might want to tune in more. What happens when a person eats carbohydrate? Your insulin rises. So the body will use carbohydrate. If you're eating that carbohydrate, the body's going to want to use it because insulin is directing traffic to only use carbohydrate. However, eating fat in the diet helps keep insulin low. The body will start to kind of shift and be like, oh shoot, we have another fuel source. This concept of being able to switch fuel sources is called metabolic flexibility. Fancy way of saying that metabolic engine in our body is able to switch between these two fuel sources, carbohydrates and fats. If it's eating carbohydrates, it'll burn carbohydrates. If it's eating fats, it'll burn fats. The real issue is that nowadays, refined starches and sugars are so readily available that they're eating all the time that the insulin levels are astronomically pushed up very high. It's essentially stuck in this high position. If we keep insulin high, especially at that stuck very high level, the person then will just go to bed with an elevated insulin. They'll wake up with that elevated insulin. Then they just continue to eat. So insulin is essentially elevated every moment of the day, these different feeding patterns. The body gets stuck in the sugar burning mode, and it's like, okay, well, I guess we'll just continue trudging down this path because it's working at this point. So when our insulin levels are perpetually elevated, essentially, that means we are only burning those carbohydrates for fuel. When we're only burning those carbohydrates for fuel, our stored fat is not being used, so it kind of just hangs out there. Your fat starts to climb as your insulin starts to climb. You're not using the fat as fuel because it's only using carbs. So this means that you're metabolically inflexible. You're not able to kind of toggle between the two like a hybrid SUV. We're carrying this fuel around, but we're never actually using it when we're constantly only consuming these processed carbohydrates, because insulin is forcing the body to only use those carbohydrates as your fuel. And being able to manipulate insulin instead of allowing insulin to manipulate you. When you consume a meal, insulin is released, and insulin's goal is to essentially gobble up the glucose, the energy from the food that you eat. It is first and foremost delivered to the cells for immediate generation of ATP or energy. However, when, let's say, all the cells are full or you are insulin resistant, aka that gate into your cells is not opening, it's resistant to opening, those excess floating glucose molecules are actually stored as fat. When our bodies need energy and don't have any food handy, it tries to turn to these fat cells for energy. As long as insulin levels are still high, though, from a previous meal, that stored energy is essentially locked in fat cells. But as insulin comes down, the cells are unlocked, and we can start to use the fat from those stored cells as energy. With this in mind, it's extremely important that we have that constant balance, which is why I always try and hit home the point of having a meal, especially snacks, that are well balanced with your protein, your carbs, and your fat. So prioritizing protein, having some fat in there, and being very conscious of the quality of all of these, of course, but especially carbohydrates. I mentioned earlier, when you go to bed with these high insulin levels and then you wake up, insulin is kind of on the trending down, and then you eat a high carbohydrate breakfast, let's say like a piece of toast and coffee, or like a piece of toast and a banana. Those are both carbohydrates. Then you're essentially respiking that insulin, not allowing your body to experience that full fat burning mode. Because again, when insulin is high, you're not burning those fat stores. So my challenge to you is to try and focus on eating a fat and protein rich breakfast. That way your body, you essentially wake up and you allow it to kind of chill. So that could be eggs, cottage cheese, avocado, maybe a piece of toast to toss in some carbs there. It could also be integrating maybe like peanut butter or nut butter of some sort.